Let's now have Thair Aburas, Fellow for Israel Research. I see he's already here. Again, Fellow for Israel Research at the University of Maryland Gildenhorn Institute. He is researching the development of Jewish identity in Israel and its impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In addition, he also has background in the Musawa Institute and the Equal Opportunity Forum. So, Thair, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Merav, and thank you, Mitvim. And I prepared to be the last speaker. So, thank you very much. We're talking about something that way back in the 1990s was popular, or at least relevant. Since then, we're no longer there. However, I hope that there will be regional changes that will lead to Arabs being able to once again play an active role in diplomatic life and in Israel's foreign policy in Israel in general. Despite all the changes that have taken place in the last 20 years, there is still one fact that hasn't changed, and that is really my main theme today, and that is that the Palestinians in Israel cannot be part of Israel's foreign policy. And to some extent, they don't want to be part of Israel's foreign policy as long as the peace discourse is one of elites. And the peace is only between elites and not nations. When the peace is between nations, or at least there is a sincere, honest attempt for this peace to be between nations, and of course it has to come from both sides, not just from the Israeli side, but since we're talking about Israel today mostly, then I'm concentrating on that. As long as there is no real attempt to have this peace between nations, Arabs in Israel don't have the ability to take or to play an active role in this peace and to divert it so that it can really be in a place where all Israeli citizens can enjoy it. And the truth is, the state of Israel, even if here and there it has announced that it is interested in collaboration or in full normalization, it was always on the theoretical level. Israel was always interested first and foremost in peace between elites based on security interests. Israel's security interests were always top priority, and everything else were prioritized differently. And if I have time, I'll talk about that. They're not really all that important. If we take, for example, peace with Egypt during Mubarak's time, then Israel always claimed that Hosni Mubarak's regime focused too much on security and security interests, and he did not agree to normalize relations in other areas. But Israel, too, never tried to step away from this reality. And for instance, to integrate the Israeli Arabs into the discourse with Egypt. And sometimes in the United States, if they wanted to pressure Egypt during Mubarak's regime, then they would ask the United States to pressure Mubarak, saying that he only collaborates with Israel on security issues. And by the way, with Jordan, the same is true, even though it's a bit different, because Jordan itself has tried to invest in its relations with the Arab society, usually for financial reasons that have to do with Jordan, because about 90% of Israeli tourism to Jordan comes from Israeli Palestinians going to Jordan. There was a time in the early 2000s where thousands of Arab students who were studying in Jordanian universities provided an interest for Jordan to invest in Israeli Arab society and get close to it. And all of these attempts to become closer did not happen formally in a normal way through the Israeli government, for instance. It was always through Arab MKs or all sorts of other ties, tribal ties, and so on, but never formally through formal channels like the Israeli government, because the government in Jordan also realized that the Israeli government is not interested in relations with Israeli Arabs, and so it didn't go through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or through the government of Israel. So there is a sort of acceptance of this fact. And I don't want to say that the Arabs in Israel are a separate entity, but it's kind of become fixated that they're not part of the Israeli foreign policy and that it's acceptable to the political elite in Israel and also to Arab society. And of course, this has to change for Arab society to be able to play a more significant role in Israeli diplomacy. And it's clear to everyone that Israeli foreign relations are very closely related to security, and we Arabs in Israel are not part of the security discourse. And that reminds me of Henry Kissinger's state. Israel doesn't have a foreign policy, it only has an interior policy or internal policy. And that's certainly true with regard to Arab society in Israel. We're just not part of the foreign policy, which is already non-existent, or at least in the past wasn't. I think in the last few years there has been a change, but not enough. That's why the nature of discourse in Israel when it comes to Palestinian Arabs and in general needs to change. Take, for example, this last week and the visit of Prime Minister Bennett. Remember that there are the million immigrants from the former Soviet Union in Israel, but we don't hear about the Israeli government's desire to have a cultural relationship and ties with the entire discourse in the media of the last week was about Syria, about the Israeli Air Force's ability to operate there. And of course, that's top of the agenda. But how can you meet with the head of a superpower like Russia, a 5-hour meeting, more than 5 hours, and we don't explain to the Israeli media that issues that have to do with cultural collaborations were part of the discourse. We also had some gossip about Ze'ev Alkin. Did he go to sleep? Did he not fall asleep during the meeting? But we don't hear anything aside from security, geostrategic discourse, or whatever you want to call it. And it's a kind of, it's part of the state of mind, whereby Israel's foreign relations are an integral part of its security discourse. And of course, there is interaction between the two, but there needs to be some form of independence for foreign policy where you can also talk about things that are not just buying and selling weapons or geostrategic issues. And of course, not only is the peace process non-existent in Israel over the last few years, but the peace discourse no longer exists. Whoever is less familiar, then we don't speak anymore about peace. We talk about separation, like divorce. They'll be there, we'll be here. It's not real peace. Even if we do reach a kind of separation, the Palestinians in the West Bank will still remain there, and you will have to, beyond the separation, continue to address them and to be in touch with them, with this population to some extent or another. A little bit about the Abraham Accords. First of all, the Abraham Accords, I think, are an example of how diplomacy and peace in Israel are fundamentally about security and defense, not just the F-35 in exchange for normalization, and not just security trade, but also the Eilat Ashkelon pipeline. And that also has to do with national security. It's true that the UAE are trying to convey a message of warm peace that we don't have with other Arab states. But the UAE are very special in the Arab world because the Emirati citizens in the Emirates form just 10% of the Emirati population. Of course, in Bahrain too, there's also unique demographics because most Bahraini citizens are Shiite, whereas the ruling elite is Sunni and views Israel as a defender against Iran. So peace with those countries too is the kind of peace that is founded on security interests, whether on the discourse, even if on the discourse level we do talk about warm peace, I still don't see any kind of warm peace. Maybe it has to do with the demographic nature of these two countries. And there is another phenomenon that I would urge you to follow. In the UAE, I'm currently writing a paper for Haaretz in English. There is an attempt to get closer to Arab society and invest in it, and that's something quite new. Jordan did it for economic interests, but in here in the Emirati society, there are no economic interests. So maybe they just want to have a soft power kind of foothold in Israeli society or in the Middle East. But I think this is a phenomenon that I do urge you to follow because I know that the Emiratis have been meeting with heads of regional councils within Arab society, and we'll see how that goes. Isawi Frej is the Minister of Regional Cooperation, of course, but Abraham Accords are not part of his job. The Palestinian issue is in the hands of Minister of Defense Benny Gantz, of course. And so his influence, his impact is not huge. It's not going to make Arabs in Israel say, okay, now we can finally impact discourse. It's a very individual case. And I know that the Palestinians, or at least the heads of the Palestinian Authority, who are working with with Israel, view Isawi as a kind of ambassador of theirs within the government. He can convey the messages of the Palestinians. He can express their views within the state of Israel, but no more than that. I know that I don't have very much time left, but I do want to talk briefly about a few trends that I see within Israel and how it can impact foreign relations. So first of all, there is the economic integration trend. But this economic integration remains within the economic sphere of Israel and does not move forward to the national sphere or even the civilian one, because Arab Israelis are outside the civilian discourse anyway, and certainly the national one, as the nation state law clearly says. So the Arabs are left out of this area. And as long as the foreign policy is perceived as part of the sovereign issues, then the Arabs will remain outside it. In the past, there was a consensus within Arab society that there are three ministries that we don't want to be a part of: the public security, the defense, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sorry, in the Ministry of Public Security, that taboo has broken. We are part of it. In the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, however, there has been no change in this regard. Israeli Arabs, according to the Knesset's Research Center, there are only 2.7% Arabs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In the Ministry of Absorption, there are zero, surprise, surprise, but in the Ministry of Religion, too, because they are part of the Ministry of Interior. So some Arabs do work in the Ministry of Interior. So in general, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is at the bottom of the list. And it's no surprise because the Arabs, not all of them, of course, but most of them that do work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are people who come from communities that do go into the army, that do try to be part of the national discourse within the state of Israel. And I think they too are not really allowed to be part of it. And I want to conclude with one final point. Other countries in the region, unlike Israel, do try to utilize their Arab minorities for their diplomatic interests. There are Arab minorities in all the neighboring countries, or in all the countries in the region. Like take Iran, for instance. In most Arab countries, the cultural attaché is usually one who comes from another background. The Turks, too, at the beginning of the civil war, the Sunni civil war, they also utilized the Sunni minority that are in a certain area of Turkey, concentrated there. And when it comes to humanitarian aid, they also played a significant role. In Ethiopia, too, the Somali minorities. I don't want to go into this discussion, this sort of argument about whether Somalis are part of the Arab population or the Arab world or not, but they too tried to utilize them. But when it comes to Israel, it didn't happen. And so they're going to say, okay, it can't happen as long as the discourse in Israel is security based, and as long as we don't make a sincere attempt to resolve the conflict we live in, which has been impacting us directly, of course, not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you very much.